So I'm going to introduce the debate today. So the theme for today's debate is social and public, and it's moderated by our very own Dr. Simon O'Rafferty. So Simon, he works in UL, but he's also a researcher and a practitioner with over 15 years experience working on design for sustainability, social innovation across multiple scales with national and local governments, multinationals and small businesses, NGOs and activists, and in urban and rural communities. He is currently a Design Research Fellow with the Irish Environmental Protection Agency, exploring the role of design and co-design in complex policy and regulatory contexts. His current projects with the EPA span the design of public services that enable behaviour change to support the transition to a circular economy, co-creation, participatory and deliberative processes for sustainable communities and community well-being, community-based interventions tackling food waste and household recycling, and behavioural trials for environmental behaviour change within public sector organisations. So he's doing a lot of work. Prior to joining the EPA, Simon worked with in the UK as a senior researcher at the Eco Design Centre in Wales, where he worked with colleagues to design support services and capacity building programmes for eco-design industry and higher education. He was also co-director of ARC Lab, a design agency that worked with UK local authorities and communities on the co-design of local services, strategies and public engagements across topics such as sustainable mobility, social inclusion and social innovation. He was also co-founder of ThinkArc, which was a design activist collective of designers, community activists and artists that developed creative interventions, encouraging people to interact with their cities in novel ways. So I'd like to welcome Simon, and he's going to introduce the panellists for today's debate.
Thanks, Myrne. So, welcome, everybody. This is not the slightest bit intimidating. But the topic for the debate is social and public. And I know in your booklets you all have the description that we sort of initially set out for this debate. But really, I suppose what we want to do is explore some of the, emerging contexts of design practice and design research, particularly in relation to design in and with and for governments, in terms of design for policy making, policy delivery, politics, and maybe some issues to do with social impact. I suppose rather than just reading the description that you have in your booklet, I suppose the rationale for this topic and why we included this topic in the debate initially, it was just a response to the overall theme of the conference in terms of catalyst for change and what that might mean. But it was also just a recognition of the recent that's a catalyst metaphor, I suppose, but acceleration of design practice within government and within public sector organizations, and just recognizing that there's something happening there. We need to understand it a little bit more. And also just reflecting on some of, I suppose, recent experiences around design practice and research in terms of things that maybe worked and didn't work in co-design and design for social innovation. For me, it was also just a recognition that there are a number of researchers within the DRS community that have been producing research over the last number of years, critically examining design practice and design research within these contexts, and asking questions about what the implications are for designers, for design practice and for design research, and some of it about considering issues around the role and positioning of design within these contexts, but also some of the researchers are looking at the implications for the policy system itself in terms of interacting with design, and then issues around representation, equality, governance, democracy, and all of these issues that we have to be confronted with if we're working in these environments, and obviously issues around social impact if you're designing policies, the medium and long-term potential social impacts, either positive or negative, that might occur. So we wanted to explore some of these issues in a very short period of time, and it's not really about an oppositional debate about two people arguing against each other, but it's really looking at these issues from two slightly different and maybe artificial stances in terms of design research outside of government and design practice within government, and just maybe understanding where those actually sometimes meet and interact in practice and work that we do. So to explore that, I'm delighted that we have Ramia Mazay, who is the professor of New Frontiers in Design in Aalto University, And Andrea Sidimok, who's the head of one of her jobs is the head of the Policy Lab as part of the Government Innovation Group within the UK Cabinet Office. And I think both Ramya and Andrea themselves have been, for the last number of years, have been really acting as leaders in terms of, I suppose, shaping opportunities for design research and design practice within government and helping to create opportunities for practitioners and for researchers to do work in this kind of environment. So it's great to have both of them here. I do also want to acknowledge, and it's something that we have discussed over the last couple of months around, in terms of looking at this topic, we have a very Northwest European perspective on the topic in terms of the speakers that we have. This is maybe something that we need to explore a little bit more later on today. And I'm not making excuses, but I take it as my personal responsibility because the two people who I wanted from outside of Europe basically couldn't make it, working in design in government. I'm not making excuses, but again, we just have to recognize this is something that we're aware of and we acknowledge it. So the format for today is quite similar to yesterday. So both Ramya and Andrea will have between 5 and 10 minutes, or maybe 10 minutes, to make a kind of an opening statement in terms of setting the context of their work and what they're doing. I will then lead out with a couple of questions, some to do with maybe the context of design within government, maybe some of the issues around design practice and design education and research. But I'll also be weaving in the questions from Slido, which I have here. So I have to try and make sure I'm listening while reading Slido. But I'm also aware some people might want to use Twitter, so I'll have Twitter open as well. So if people want to propose questions on Twitter, I'll also be trying to take questions from Twitter. So the only thing I just need to say, I suppose, and I hope you don't mind me saying it, Andrea. So Andrea is you are a civil servant. So Andrea will actually be bound by the Civil Service Code. So depending on the questions that appear, we might have to think about how, I suppose, Andrea's position in terms of being able to answer them or not. But I'll leave that to you. So without further ado, I'd like to invite both of you to the stage, please. Thanks. So in terms of order, we're going to go from my right to left, and I suppose Andrea or Ramya, you can start with your opening position, if that's okay.
Very good. Thank you, Simon. Yes. So in my experience, design is enmeshed all the time in power relations and hegemonies, political regimes, and ideologies. This is something my early education in architecture taught me to analyze alongside creative, aesthetic, and technical aspects of practice. It's something I found lacking in my subsequent design, education, and practice. And perhaps this isn't surprising. Architecture has long dealt with public space and been employed by monarchs and the state. We've long understood that architecture can do the work of police and military. Consider Haussmann's urban plan for Napoleon III that inserted grand boulevards in Paris to better survey the population and suppress revolution. Or a more contemporary example, Mike Davis's Fortress LA. Architecture can enforce political ideologies in lasting material forms. Consider Robert Moses's racial class basis for infrastructure in New York City, and too many other similar examples. While different from architecture in many and important ways, design is also political. While architecture exerts power through physical means, boulevards and borders for surveillance and control, architecture designed tools, toolkits, interactions, routines, networks, programs, games, algorithms, etc., exert more subtle but effective forms of regulatory and what I would call biopolitical power. This example from Luisa Prado's doctoral research makes the point. In 1961, within her research, she traces engineer David Wagner's design of the round package, still ubiquitous today, that mimicked a calendar for his wife to track her intake of birth control pills. Prado articulates how this packages embody patriarchal anxiety about women's ability to manage their own fertility. Further developing philosopher Paul Preciado's analysis of the pill package as an apparatus of biopolitical self-surveillance and quote-unquote edible panopticon, referring to Foucault's theorization of surveillance architecture. In delegating control or governance over individual conduct, as in this example, to a non-human actor, here a package, in other cases, perhaps a healthcare provider, design effectively creates, quote unquote, according in Louisa's research, actors ontologically designed to comply. Arguably, design as governing behavior always has political implications. This is evident and even intentional in persuasive design, design for behavior change, as some of my early work in the design research program Static and Switch has explored in energy consumption. And in the area of design for policy, design doing governance is also explicit, as Jocelyn Bailey, somewhere here, investigates in her doctoral research, and I paraphrase her. Design practices, as applied in government, are concerned with generating new devices of governing, for example, chatbots to lead you through your visa or asylum application. New ways of being a civil servant, for example, design games, co-design methodologies. And new ways of being a citizen, for example, co-production or participation in service design or delivery. Especially where explicitly used for behavior change, design is concerned with and indeed promises and provides tools for the conduct of the self-governance. This can be seen as an example of governmentality in action, the conduct of conduct. Design provides new understandings of and capacities to manipulate the interface between the personal and the state. Today, it is design, perhaps more than architecture, that is being called upon by governments. This EC action plan frames the task of design to drive renewal in the public sector and modernization of public administration. And Design for Europe, which carries out the action plan, highlights Finland and the course for which I've been responsible with Sung-Ho Lee and a great teaching team at Aalto University. The political task of design is rapidly expanding in important examples such as the UK Policy Lab, which we'll hear a lot more about, and many other labs, as well as embedded designers in government, such as Simon. As several design theorists have observed, design has thrived with the rise of neoliberal forms of governance, in the EC directive entering government through the Trojan horse of innovation. Design is well suited to the diffusion of neoliberal and market logics in our societies and in our lives. Beside long-standing roles of design in governing bodies and behaviors, the political role of design has expanded categorically as designers and design today operate within governmental institutions. But what's at stake is much more than new job opportunities or yet another domain for practice. And unfortunately, design theory is struggling to keep pace with the rapid expansion in practice. Daniel Opazzo, Matthias Wolff, and Maria Jose Araya have recently problematized our preoccupation in design and design research with questions of how and what, the process and the outcome. They interrogate instead the political situation of design, engaging with particular political theories in order to position, conduct, and analyze their participatory and public space projects in Chile. They focus upstream of how and what, on what I would call why, or the political rationales conditioning design. Why, for me, is a critical question, and it's one of the kinds of critical questions that I've been preoccupied with, together with, in a pilot this spring with Jocelyn Bailey, Eva Berglund, Maria Ferreira-Lithochenko, Guy Julier, Lucy Kimball, Min Lei, Charlie Mealings, Afra, and an increasing number of design researchers in political administration on this topic. Why interrogating why design is called upon, why design emerges in governance, may help us grasp the rationales and political situations into which design is called. And there are many calls or types of calls for design. Some invoke innovation or efficiency, which in a European context resonates with austerity rationales and programs of management reform, reorganization, and redistribution. Other calls evoke complexity and wickedness or uncertainty and experimentation. Participation is also a door through which design enters, but there are many kinds of rationales at play within calls for participation. It may be framed in terms of restoring public trust in perhaps a rather superficial way, retaining top-down logics. It may be framed in terms of strong democracy, citizen participation, and public deliberation, but often this is incompatible with rationales of efficiency and expertise. Nor may deliberation change the ground rules for debate, power dynamics, and predefined relevant people and publics in the issue. So why does why matter? And I believe there are several reasons. Different rationales indicate different political situations and conditions that we enter into and under which we therefore agree to design. Different whys imply different hows and whats, even different kinds of design. Is the call for design thinking, strategic design, service design, co-design, transition design, systems design, game design, blah, blah, blah? Design is never the only or even the best possible how or what. We must consider the scope and the limits of design. In design for policy, we're elbow to elbow with digital, behavioral sciences, who are experts on efficiency and leverage, all those working with agile and AI everything. Other disciplines and practices are rapidly absorbing design thinking and skills. And while we have and need plenty of design, including the kind of design that anyone can do, we also and increasingly need critically and politically situated design. And this is what I argue we should be leading in design research. To conclude with one of the starting points for Camilla Anderson's doctoral research that makes the point. Sweden's national equity policy, here on the screen, is the frame for her Vinnova-funded, it's a Swedish governmental funder for innovation systems, through which she and her team were funded. The project team revisited basic assumptions such as innovation, progress, and technology in terms of the kind of rationales within this governmental and the Vinnova discourse. The project team looked at innovation, progress, and innovation in terms of a history of ideas that's predominantly male and Western suprematist, following Sandra Harding, a post-colonial STS scholar. And they reframed their terms and methodologies accordingly and critically to a research context of health and elderly care within regions and municipalities, rethinking actually what innovation, what the rationales and logics of innovation should be within a socioeconomically strained and female and immigrant-dominated sector. So asking why and where the call for design comes from, regardless of the rationale or the actual government in power, as a starting point for both research and practice, is how I'd like to position myself.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ramya. And Andrea?
Good morning. It's fantastic to hear Ramya mention some of the work that the European Commission did, and Rachel and I spent 18 months with the Commission trying to understand the role that design might play on a broader stage. And I think quite a number of those months were spent asking the question, what is design? And it was quite interesting and probably a useful starting point to just make the point that design comes in so many different guises.
Yes.
And so for me, it's been about finding, exactly as Ramia said, where are the limits of design? Are there limits of design? And how do different contexts shape design? And how does design shape different contexts? So back in 2001, I gave a keynote in Seoul about, entitled Beyond the Bauhaus, which was about moving from a mechanistic worldview into a future worldview that took account of a lot of contradictions that we see in the broader context, whether it's political, environmental, sociological change. So from that point of view, I was interested in how design might move from design of detail, design of form, into the design of services and processes, and then beyond into the design of policy or the context. And really, over the last 20 years, which pretty much since I last was at the DRS in the mid-90s, I've been exploring that in one way or another. Initially at the Design Council, through running and developing their challenge programme, and then more recently in the UK government at the Policy Lab. So I put this set of words on to kick off, really, with a question, which is, where is design? If we talk about public, social, and governmental application of design, where does design fit? So if there's a theme that I'm going to talk about throughout the slides, it's really about that adaptation of design and how it fits within what is already quite a complex system, as Ramia said, around behavioural insights, economics, and other dominant professions which occupy this space. A living experience, when I joined government, I had to do a drop-down menu and choose my profession. And I found on the list actuaries, but I didn't find designers. And so actuaries measure risk. They analyse risk. And yet design has a powerful way of unearthing where risks may lie, but it wasn't one of the drop-down menus. So design in the context of government, I think, fits within both the political, the art of politics, the craft of policy making, the science of management, new public management over many decades, and into also the pragmatics of delivery. And for me, if nothing else you take from this, it is the role of design as an enabler of the stepping between strategy and delivery, or ideas and implementation, bridging that gap that is often very difficult for organisations to do is very important, and a role for design. Incidentally, the Cabinet Office, for the first time, has the word design in its objectives. We have 3 objectives at the Cabinet Office in the UK government, and the word design appears in there for the first time. This is our team. This is based in the Sky Room, which is in the Treasury. It overlooks Big Ben. To give you a bit of geography, if you looked out the window of this room, you would see Big Ben. Well, you wouldn't, it was covered in scaffolding. But when we built the room, you could see Big Ben. And just to make the point that our team is very diverse. So we have one service designer who also has a master's in public policy. I trained as an industrial designer and have done my master's in policy and economics at the London School of Economics and my PhD in digital. Here, for example, some of the people who've worked with the lab, our team is only 8 people, so the people in the picture are an extended team, but it includes people like Jay Paul, who we work with on some of our speculative design work. It includes people from all around the world, so that we second in people, most recently from Peru, from Australia and New Zealand. So a real mix, so addressing that kind of Western, Northwestern centricism. That's probably not the case in the lab. We have 2 ethnographers. We also have researchers, and of course, fundamental to our effectiveness in government has been the leadership of policy officials. So the lab itself is not led by design, it's led by policy experts, and we apply design. And we apply 3 Ds: design, digital, and data science. So we utilize all number of different tools and methods, and you can see those on the Open Policy Making Toolkit. So one of the things that one of our designers who came from the Royal Society of Arts Design Prize, a student who joined us, what she wanted to do is really map the world of policy. So she started by mapping what happens if you write a letter to your MP where does that go? How many touch points within the system? And this, it's not public yet. Obviously, you can see it. But there's a video that flies through the journey of a letter. And it starts to unfold the sheer amount of complexity that policymakers have to deal with. In the UK government, there are 20,000 policymakers, to give you a sense of scale. And at any one time, maybe 200 priorities of government, everything, you know, from space security to social housing and many others. For me, the role of design, the role of policy are actually quite similar. They both look at a range of different elements and have a process of synthesis, and they also both utilize the power of modeling. But it's about choices. So this photo I took in Soho in London, and you can see here 3 parking spaces. The first one says doctor, the second one says disabled. I'm not sure if you can read the third one. What does the third one say? So this is prime London parking space. And you know, to get a space here is really hard. So we've had to make decisions as a society about who gets the third space. So if you're a taxi in this space, you have slightly different rules, but no, it's not delivery. Or delivery, did you say? It is electric. So it's one of many examples where government has to make a choice. It has to make a trade-off between priorities of different constituents. And in this case, if you're disabled, if you're a doctor, or if you're driving an electric vehicle, you are the same in parking terms. Obviously, if you are a disabled doctor driving an electric vehicle, you've got free rein. But who's to say that we should favour one group of people over another? And these are power choices. This is some of the work that we've been doing, and I won't explain in detail, but the Policy Lab does around 10 projects a year for the Prime Minister and government departments. To date, we're 5 years old, so we've done around 40 projects. We work on social issues using the ethnography, but we also, for example, at the moment, things like digital forensics, cybersecurity and space security, marine autonomy. We've heard of autonomous cars. There's also shipping that contains that same kind of AI technology. And so we've been working on that. So a real breadth of topics, and so far I've found no limits. But this is some work we did on the future of ageing. We're working with the Department for Bays on the industrial strategy and ageing grand challenges. And here we were looking at what the future looks like. And this has all come out of evidence. So a 200,000 word report was written, and these visualizations are evidenced directly from that report data. So you could read the report, or you could put the speculation in the world and gain feedback from citizens in how they feel about that world. I always tell the example when we were in Manchester, those of you who know Manchester, they said it must be the future when they saw the visualization, because it's not raining, and therefore global warming must have happened. And actually, it was just really hard to render rain in the visualization, so it was a bit of a design quirk. What we've also been doing, and one of the things I wanted to finish with, was mapping the way that policymakers exert their influence. And again, as I said, design and policymakers both share the tool of mapping as well as the tools of synthesis. And so we've been developing, this is the marine autonomy. So this is everyone in a room talking about the next 30 years of shipping. So it would be the insurers, it would be the shipbuilders, it would be the freight companies, everybody. And we use this thing called 28 levers for change. 28 levers for change we developed in the Policy Lab, really to help people navigate the future. I like a nice simple diagram. So this is the 28 levers for change, and you can see on it, on the left-hand side, there are various levels of change, some of which are more traditional policy making, and these tend to be quite slow. So making laws takes quite a long time, and the world, as won't have escaped you, moves quite quickly. So one of the things that we've sought to do with this mapping of the landscape is to find ways that government can operate systemically working with others to get things done in a way that utilises the full range of possibilities. And government often works in many of these boxes. So you'll see on here, for example, the convening power, where your president or your prime minister stands on the steps of their residence, and they're able to make stuff happen just by saying it. And that's a really powerful role that obviously states and leaders use, right the way through to choice architecture of behavioural insights, and so on. The role of government as a procurer, the role of government as an innovator and as a reformer is also in there. So we've turned this into the toolkit that you see there, where actually in workshops people can start to say, well, how might we use these powers in new ways? So for us, it's a common ground where we're starting to look at the different ways that government might operate and how design might enable that. We are constantly evolving, and I think the beauty of design in the sort of 20-odd years that I've been working in it is its ability to evolve and not be bound by last year's thinking or last year's tools or last year's ways of working. And I think that for me, the power of design is its ability to redesign and reform its own practice. And in doing so, that's why I love my job. I mean, I got into design because I wanted to make a difference to people's lives. And I found in central government an entirely new space to start to do that and to also be accountable for the outcomes of citizens. So it's been amazing space to experiment, and we're just in the foothills of doing that.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Andrea. So, I promise I have been listening, but I've also been trying to read Slido and Twitter at the same time. So there's a lot of interesting questions coming in, and we'll hopefully get to maybe group some of them together and address them all. So there's a couple of questions coming in around issues to do with the decolonization of design, those kind of issues that we've been discussing a lot. Issues around the kind of the positioning of the designer as a neutral individual within the policy context and the politics around that we have to deal with. And there's been some interesting questions just to do with complexity and the kind of the structural changes that are happening around policy and how we have to maybe consider that and understand that as designers. But I just wanted to pick, there was a few threads between both of your presentations, and it kind of linked in with actually my first kind of question, which is something that I still haven't really been able to answer. But policy design as a practice and as a practice in government and as a topic of research has been around for many, many decades, mainly in the political sciences. And so that terminology of designing policies has been around for a very long time. But the way we, in terms of us, the way we discuss it in terms of design within policy is quite a new entrant into the field of government and in policy. And there's a lot of critical papers within political science almost saying, who are you to come in here and start using design in government without the kind of historical context and understanding of power structures and that kind of stuff. So I just wanted to kind of just to tease out a little bit about what your perspectives are on why is this happening now, and is it the supply side in terms of designers going into government trying to make change happen, or is there something about the demand from government for, I suppose, new ways of approaching design, and what's maybe driving that, whether some structural issues or other more immediate concerns around experimentation and new ways of developing policy? That's a very long question, but I'm just wondering if you could just to kind of explore a little bit more about why is this stuff happening now and where might it go?
Shall I start? Mm-hmm. I'm not a historian. I wish I was, actually. And I think design emerges, and anyway, it looks very different in different fields and in different parts of the world. I mean, there are fields called policy design. In the EU funding program, the word design is mentioned 5 times under the ERC category, one of which is pharmaceutical design, 1 out of 5. So there are many very open uses of the term design. It looks very different in different places, in different languages, speaking of the decolonization, and so on. I mean, the trajectory that I traced from architecture as an instrument of power to design as an instrument of power has been written quite a lot about in terms of how types and forms of government need different instruments for managing populations. And again, my definition of political is basically how society is constituted and organized, a very broad. So many governments do the political in many different ways. And while in previous centuries, say 500 years ago, it was through hard power, it was through warfare, it was through military, it was through border walls, it was through hard mechanisms. And in the last 200 years, with the rise of liberal forms of governance and now neoliberal forms of governance, those instruments, those regulatory mechanisms have softened. And design, I believe, and it's been well argued, is particularly able to operate at the kind of in these soft power ways and in the soft spaces through which the state communicates with the individual and regulates everyday life, community behavior, law and order, but in much softer ways than previously. And then, of course, these kind of languages of innovation is very close to design. That is, as I see, and has been traced actually by design historian, dean of our school, Anna Valtonen, as the way through which design has risen up into the top echelons of both funding and but also political power.
Right.
I think that this, you know, as we've said, the design takes many forms. There has been a rush of design, if you like, with the digitization and digital agenda. There are genuinely hundreds of designers in the UK government doing digital roles and many, many more doing service design. But I remember distinctly mid-2000s, people saying service design didn't exist. And in a way, that kind of makes the point that I wanted to make about the fact that these are quite emergent disciplines, both for design. But I think that one of the things I've learned from my experiment of putting myself as a designer into a government setting is the importance of humility. There is always the hubris around the fact that design is some kind of solution to everything, including solutions. And actually, I've needed to up my game in terms of my ability to present concrete evidence. The standard of evidence in government is higher than anywhere I've ever worked, in the private sector or outside of government. And we've had to make design more rigorous as a result. And in doing that, we've had to embrace big data in order to give us more of a context of what is happening at scale. So we know how many millions of people might be affected by a policy. And then also utilising thick data of ethnography in order to tell us why it's happening. But the gap, and the thing that I've written about in many of my PowerPoints, the diagram I didn't share today, is once you know that, once you've established what it is you're trying, what the context is, what are you going to do about it? And it's moving that into practical action where the design skill set really comes into the fore. So whether it's digital, developing new services that are more citizen-centred, or whether it's a policy about, well, what are we going to do about homelessness? Or what are we going to do in the future in response to the technologies like AI and blockchain? And this is the space where designers are very comfortable. They're comfortable with ambiguity, they're comfortable with complexity, and they can tune in to the needs and behaviours and sensibilities of other people. And we've always been described as kind of a breath of fresh air from that point of view, but I never really talk about design. And so we talk about what needs to be done and how might we utilise a range of different disciplines, professionals, in order to get that done. And therefore, as a consequence, design has to be a little bit more humble.
Great. I like the phrase humble. It's obviously very important. Obviously, I've been my own practice being within government and dealing with people who are experts in environmental policy and regulation and trying to understand what my role
It goes both ways. The experts have to be more humble too, because the thing that drives a lot of this is the promise of co-design and enabling citizens to have greater voice. And so on our social housing work, we have gone out and spent time with 1,000 citizens who are tenants of housing, and get their voice directly and their ideas. And that's unusual for government.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's really interesting that you don't use the word design. I think that's really telling also as well. And you speak instead in terms of goal or what's in common, what's the aim. And I think it's useful to anyway start naming what is it that design does in a way that also helps differentiate from what does ethnography do, what does the AI, the data do. And I think this humility is also something to highlight. It's very challenging to our traditional paradigms of the designer in our education and so on, humility. Also in our audience is Mariana Amatula, whose doctoral thesis identified different kind of design attitudes or capabilities. And I think that's also a useful way. And ambiguity is one of them. So these ways that we are trained, whether or not we work in design or call ourselves a designer, are very useful to put words on in a way. And I think this kind of ambiguity, working with ambiguity, complexity, and perhaps I'd be very happy to add the term humility, and finding one's own limits as something that designers are capable of doing.
I mean, when I spoke to a colleague in government who was very senior, and I asked them the question, what do you think design brings? They were really clear, and they said it's optimism. It's this kind of relentless optimism that we can do better and that the future can be better, and that positive energy is a driver of change as opposed to other forces for change which may be more negative. So it's often the case that others can see the value in design, that designers are just, it's classic, as McLuhan said, fish would never invent water. When you're in it, you can't see it. So sometimes one of the things that I think we found as a design team within government was that we wouldn't state the obvious, what was obvious to us, and we needed to get better at simplifying the message, taking away the jargon. The amount of people I meet who really trip up on words like ethnography, and it puts everyone back in their silos, their professional silos. And our work is all about getting rid of that complexity, making things understandable, because if it's complex, then citizens really find it much harder to engage with. So for us, simplifying the language, getting rid of all the sort of unnecessary jargon is crucial to being able to talk about it.
Can I just pick up on something? There's something, and again, I don't want to just drive my own interest in the discussion, but there's something that you've both mentioned around kind of evidence and knowledge and the different types of knowledge that might be generated by design. And I suppose my experience is that whether it's true or not, but it seems that evidence is what is the kind of part of the oil of policy, and the importance of evidence because of ensuring public value, not causing social harm, and those kind of issues. And then just thinking about some of the questions that people are asking about the position of design within that, and the types of knowledge that's being produced by designers working within government, and recognizing that maybe they're potentially causing harm, and understanding their own biases, or maybe not understanding how the knowledge that they're producing might be used by the political process or political mechanism. But is there just some way you can just talk a little bit about the types of knowledge that you see are being generated in design and how they help or not?
I think one of the so we use design in lots of different ways. So like the mapping that you saw, often policymakers find the aesthetics of design a really important and powerful added value. And one of the dilemmas, if you like, that we have in terms of knowledge production is that there is a pre-existing way of communicating within government that follows the briefing. And the briefing might be a 1 or 2 page synopsis of something that's hugely complicated. So imagine the most complicated thing you can think of. How can you make that a 2-page artifact that can be shared with the minister? That concision is an incredible skill. It's a synthesis and it's a concision. Well, design has that, but it's very rare for images to make it into those kind of briefings, or even into the PowerPoint packs. So often the case, I have to make judgments all the time between, do I do this in words, or do I do it in images, or diagrams, or photographs? And they definitely, as different forms of knowledge, land in very different ways within a political system.
Is there something about prototyping? You know, because I know, say, Lucy Kimball's work, she's exploring kind of, you know, the role of prototypes within the policy system. Is there something around that as a specific type of design-related knowledge that you've seen has some influence or not within the policy system?
I think now I'm caught up on the word prototyping.
That was part of my question, because sometimes we get fixated on the prototype. But anyway, so that's...
No, we did actually, it was quite, one of the things that we said is, so how do we know that we're actually having an impact in it? What is a system of 400,000 people? That's just the civil service. And we said the word prototyping wasn't being used in government 4 years ago, not very much, if at all. And we would therefore track the use of a word like prototyping to see how mainstream that had become. We prototype all the time, and then on those prototypes we have to say, this is not official government policy, because it's a little bit like the War of the Worlds radio broadcast, where if you make it so believable, people believe it's a real thing. So we prototype new letters, we prototype new ways that the private rental system might work, gloves that you might wear if you were protecting a crime scene and you're the police, and you have to turn off your mobile phone so that your data, your mobile phone doesn't corrupt the crime scene. We designed some gloves that would give you a checklist reminder. Very simple prototype, but of course they're so believable that people think they're real policy. So we've had to kind of caveat some of that.
I think this is a really interesting point, because this is, besides attitude or capabilities, design produces and expresses knowledge in very different ways. And I think the materiality that you talked about, the choice between words, images, diagrams, and photographs is something we know a lot about, but we know very little about what that does within collaborative processes, within behavioral change, within persuasion of different types of people. And I think that's one of, besides the question why, I think follow the materialities would be a really important way of kind of tracking how design knowledge appears, is produced, and then has tangible effects, perhaps in different ways than other forms of expression do. I think that's really, really important. And then I think thinking about your question about risk, like what actually happens with those. You make choices, what happens to that? I would love to study that, and we should all be looking at that. And then the question is, how do you assess what risks or that might have, or what impacts? That actually is something that I think we have not prepared designers to think about properly in education. In architectural education, because of the legal standing of the architect, it's basically accountability, both legally and in terms of insurance claims, have to account for the building continues to remain standing, and different kind of very specific definitions of the responsibility for architecture after it's been built. And I think that kind of thinking about including the procedures, the codes, the legal and other kinds of harms that can be caused is part of many professional educations, medicine, law, architecture, and not yet part of design.
I mean, we had a very brief discussion yesterday actually about this in terms of, I suppose my understanding was we need to think about the kind of ethics of design, and you sort of said, well, ethics is kind of usually a kind of a binary, is it good or bad? Whereas actually what you're saying is understanding the politics and maybe implications of the knowledge that you create within the particular political system that you're working within. And it just, it's, again, maybe that's a very